If you haven't heard about Bitcoin and its recent explosion to all-time highs, you're probably not watching any TV or reading any news or media sources because it's blowing up the internet right now. Today, I'm going to do a deep dive look into Bitcoin using many different technical analysis tools and techniques to predict where I think the price of Bitcoin is actually headed. Bitcoin is actually one of the very first assets I traded back in the middle of 2017. I was lucky enough to catch the extreme bull run we saw in late 2017, where I bought in around the low $1,000 to $2,000 range as my first purchase and had some sells all the way up in the $19,000 range. I was also then unlucky enough to watch and ride Bitcoin all the way down from those $19,000, almost $20,000 highs, all the way down to $3,000 once again. Now, fortunately, ever since I learned about Bitcoin in 2017, I've been extremely bullish on the future of it. So when we pushed back to those low $3,000 and $4,000 price range and we started consolidating in there in early 2019, I actually loaded up on a bunch of Bitcoin myself. And for full transparency, I'm still holding this Bitcoin. I haven't sold any of it that I bought in this early stage of 2019 here, around $4,000. I think the very long term of Bitcoin will see prices that are extremely higher than we are right now, but that doesn't mean we can't actually trade this on a daily chart or even a 4-hour or 2-hour chart and sell when I think the price is going to peak and then buy back much, much lower. Because of course, with any market, with any asset, there's going to be extreme pullbacks, and so there's no reason to actually ride these out if we can make a good prediction of when it's going to happen and to what price we're going to pull back to. That's the ultimate goal of technical analysis. So while I plan to keep a bunch of Bitcoin in my long-term portfolio, selling high and buying back lower will allow me to have even more Bitcoin. And this accumulation of Bitcoin is my ultimate goal. Anyways, let's dive into the technical analysis here. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know that the very first thing I like to do on a chart is just put on some support and resistances. These are incredibly important in the market and drive a lot of the technical analysis that we actually see happen. They're extremely easy to get used to, extremely quick, and extremely helpful. So let's go ahead and get started with it. I'm going to use the horizontal ray tool here myself. You can use any of the different line tools on TradingView or whatever platform that you're on. Now all I'm going to do is just note the extreme highs, the extreme lows of all of the different moves we've had. You can see that the Bitcoin price has been pretty volatile over time, so there's a whole bunch of these highs and lows. Now, I actually personally trade Bitcoin on Binance, which is the chart I was just showing you before. However, Bitcoin was only added to Binance around the beginning of 2018 or late 2017. It actually traded on Coinbase much before that, back in 2014. So in order to see the price history ever since December of 2014, which is going to be enough data for us, of course, Bitcoin was traded before that, back in 2008. However, the price of Bitcoin before this was so low, it would be minuscule on our chart anyways. As you can see, even the beginning parts here, when we were in the $1 to even up to $800 range, is pretty small and almost unnoticeable on the chart anyways. So this will do for now in terms of drawing support and resistance and getting some technical analysis on this. So I'm going to start with the very obvious ones here, all the way at our peaks that we had in December of 2017. This is going to be our first key support and resistance zone. And then our low after that, all the way down here around 3,100. We have our next peak in here, up around 13,900. Our next low in here, down around 3,900. And those are the four super obvious ones. Now let's start to draw in some of the other ones that we see on this chart. We actually can see inside of this wick right in here that it actually lines up very well with the support we drew back here. So I'm just going to end up pulling this line sideways so we can include both of these lows into here. They might not be exactly perfect, but it's definitely close enough, especially in this zoomed out scale here. And then looking even further left, it looks like these highs in here are that same exact support and resistance line. So let's pull it even a little bit further in here. And look how good that pink line looks. We can even pull it up just a hair in here, just to see if we can catch that a little bit closer. You can see this is a huge resistance we had when we started running from about $900 in March 2017 all the way up until about $3,000 in June 2017 before a massive pullback down to the $1,700 or $1,800 range here. And then once we broke out of it, we got the classic retest of our support and resistance. Let's just zoom in and take a look at that because this is an awesome learning opportunity. This resistance zone we had was tested twice in here, and when we finally broke out of it, we broke out above it by about $2,000. Now, had you missed this move, what you should have been looking for is this retest. This is extremely common, to retest previous resistance and use it as support. So once we retested and closed above this line, this would have been a really good signal. Of course, we're looking at this in hindsight, but this retest is an awesome signal as a buying entry going forwards. And you can see, of course, that price exploded after this retest. Let's draw in some more support and resistances. So I'm just hovering my mouse around here, catching some of these lows in here. So through here and here and here and all through this zone as well. This is all the same support and resistance line. And there you go. I think this line looks really good. So we had this resistance through here. Again, zooming into this part, we broke out of this finally. This was a minor breakout, not quite counting, I would say. We only had one candle that really closed fully above it before we ended up breaking below that line again. So we would need a little bit more than that for confirmation, such as a move like this upwards. And once again, we retested that support and resistance line before we rocketed upwards. And then this line ended up being support back in here, and all through here before we finally broke down to our previous support and resistance line. So all of the support and resistance lines that I'm going to draw, you're going to see this very similar pattern where they have these breakouts and retests and then breakouts further, or even when we start to come back down, they're used as supports again. Once you practice drawing these on your chart enough, it's going to become second nature, and you can draw all these support and resistance zones in just a couple of minutes on an entire chart. So now I'm going to go through this quickly and just add more of them because I think you understand how to draw them and what I'm actually looking at. I see another one right through here. You can see that it's used a lot all throughout its price history. I've got another one up in here that I'm seeing. Resistance in here, support throughout all of this area, and a whole bunch of resistance through this area. Once again, we get that breakout, retest, rocket. We've got another one around this level into here, resistance, and some support through here. And then I'd say we've got one more in here. This is where we started to push back up, and we tried to get back to those all-time highs before a huge drop downwards. We didn't really resist it on the way back up here, but we definitely did support this line before we headed back up to this resistance and eventually broke out. So I think on a daily chart here, we have our support and resistances in line. So if we were going to trade off of this and nothing more, one simple thing we could look for is price to come back down and retest this super strong resistance that we had. This is our all-time high resistance. We resisted it again before we broke out, pulled back down from about almost $20,000 down to $17,500. So this looks like a small move on the chart. It's actually about $2,500 pullback right here. So pretty strong resistance. And then finally we broke out. So a really good trade you could look for based on the pattern that I was just showing you with a bunch of our different support and resistance lines and their breakouts and retests is price to come back down at some point in time, touch this pink line, and then continue back upwards. Now, when we continue back upwards, are we going to put in new highs, or are we just going to put in slightly lower highs and then start heading downwards after that? That's hard to say right now, but I'm willing to bet that when we do pull back, if we come down and test this $19,735-ish range, we're going to have a significant bounce off of it. So taking a long here would be a really good play for sure. Now, when we get that pullback, it could be right now. It could be $6,000 or $7,000 higher. It's hard to know at this point in time, at least with only using support and resistance lines. And this is because Bitcoin is currently in price discovery, where it's putting in new all-time highs every single day, and there's no resistance above it from previous data. Next up, let's dive into some Fibonacci retracements. I'm going to give a quick summary of how I like to use Fibonacci retracements for anyone who is new to my channel. Of course, if you've watched any of my previous videos, this is just going to be a recap, but hopefully it's information that's helpful and helpful to see again. To use Fibonacci retracements, you grab this Fib retracement tool. If you're on TradingView, it might be slightly different depending on your platform, and you can just draw it onto your chart like this by clicking once and then clicking again somewhere higher, or you could do it vice versa, click at the top and click at the bottom if you want to chart a bearish Fib retracement. If you want your Fib retracement to look like mine does, because out of the box it's pretty ugly and tough to use, I do have a video on how I set this up. I'd recommend you check that out. So when I'm using these Fibonacci retracements, I'm targeting two main zones. The first one is this red line I have drawn in the middle here, and it's the 0.5 or 50% retracement of the pull. Basically, it's the halfway point between the two spots I clicked right here. The second target I always look for is the combination of this gold and yellow line, which I call my golden zone, and it's between the 61.8% and 65% retracement targets. If we get a bounce off of either of these zones, so from this 50 here or from this golden zone down here, my first target to the upside is this green line here. It's the negative 0.236. In other words, it's the distance from this 0 to the 236 here, or the 23.6% retracement, but then flipped on top of itself rather than downwards here. And my second target is this blue 618. My third target is this red -1 up here. So that's a quick summary of how I like to use fib retracements. Let's see how it actually looks on the chart. When price had this extreme move downwards from our previous all-time highs all the way back down to that $3,000 range, we wanted to have a Fibonacci retracement bearish pull on this because we know that those fib levels are going to be extremely tough to get through, especially when you're looking at a daily chart like this. So I had this pull on my chart where you click from the top here, and then you click at the bottom of our lows, and you can pull this sideways. And you can see exactly where price ended up going before we had our rejection, pulling back from almost $14,000 all the way back into the $3,000 range. So this was, of course, extremely significant. And you can see it fell with the wick just inside of that golden zone right there. So if you were open to shorting Bitcoin and you were watching this at that point in time, this is the most ideal trade setup you could take to open a short position here. And like I said, you would typically be targeting this green negative 0.236. However, if you look at this, it's actually in the $- range. And of course, nothing can go below $0, so this would have been an unrealistic target for this pull. You would have had to come up with a target in a different way, or maybe just been looking for a certain dollar amount target, and you probably would have had it at some point since we pulled back more than $10,000. So now let's zoom a bit more into the actual move we just had. So just looking at the rest of the daily chart here, I don't really see too many other Fibonacci pulls that we would even try. We could try from the lows down here to the peak up here, but I can see just by eyeballing it, it's going to be past all of our levels. Of course, our golden zone in here was support for a little while, and we had a nice bounce off of it, but that fib pull has broken by now. And pulling from this low into here to any of these up here, I can just tell doesn't have a deep enough fib retracement. So if we pull from here up to here, you can see that we only hit even less than that 0.382 or 38.2% retracement. Up to here, it's even shallower than that, and we really haven't had any pullbacks since then. Moving forward from here, I'm going to take the assumption that this is a significant low in here. I'm not going to try and validate it with any sort of Elliott wave or geometry or anything like that. I think we can all agree on the fact that this $3,800 level right here, as we're looking at it now, is a significant low as we've pushed off of it extremely. Since Bitcoin is about 525% higher in price than it was from this low. So let's zoom into a 2-hour chart here and just use this low and try and do some technical analysis off of that bottom. So I'm once again going to pull out my fib retracement tool, and I'm going to see if I can find any significant fib retracements that have been acting well with their retracements and then acting well on the target side as well. So if I just pull from the low down here, I'm not really seeing anything that would look good. We don't really have a deep enough retracement on any of these. Let's try using this low in here, which is pretty much our first pullback after a really strong move upwards to about $10,000 in here, pull back to about $8,100. So if I just click here as my low and start pulling around with this, using this as the high for it. So I pulled from this low to this high, and you can see how significant this one actually was. Once we pulled back down from this $12,500 range, we pulled back almost perfectly to our golden zone once again. And afterwards, we started rocketing upwards. Now, like I said, buying at this golden zone is an absolute perfect trade. And I mentioned that if you can get into this trade, the first target, this green line right here. You can see this green line is actually a spot where we had some resistance. We were pretty much moving exponentially from about $11,250 all the way up to this green range around $13,500, where we hovered around this for about a week total before we rocketed past it again all the way up to about $16,000. So this is target 1, and it hit for us and was nice resistance in here. So this looks good so far. Target 2, this blue line. And if we just zoom in, right when we came to this blue line, this red candle wicked it almost perfectly. we had a pullback from about $15,300 all the way down to $14,800 in one 2-hour candle right at this blue line. And you can see price kind of just hovered around this blue line for a while. From about November 5th all the way through maybe November 15th. Yeah, we got a bit above it up in here, but price definitely hovered around this area for a while before our next push upwards into this red line, where again, we almost perfectly rejected it. Here we rejected around 16,900, so about $60 short of our third target, this red -1 here. Price only hovered this for maybe a day or two before we continued upwards once again. And our fourth target, which usually doesn't even get hit, and I didn't mention it earlier, is this -1.618. So the golden line here is our 0.618. This is our -1.618, and it's our fourth target. And it's actually the last target I have on these negative fib pulls. And you can see we almost made it up to that the first time here, maybe about $200 short before we had a $3,000 pullback. Came back up a second time and rejected the line exactly on in here before another $3,000 pullback. And finally, once we broke past this golden line, that's when price just has continued rocketing upwards and upwards and hasn't stopped since. So this fib retracement was of course significant, however we've blown past all of the targets of it. So let's just keep scrolling up. Do we have anything more recent that will give us more significance? And if I just look at this, we have this significant pullback that we were just talking about. That's about a $3,000 pullback right here. I'm going to use that as our low now, and then use our next high, the spot that we actually had our next resistance at in here, and pull this one sideways. So let's take a look at this pull. We came up here, and as soon as we hit this top peak right here, we had a significant pullback, and it was only in about 2 candles here from 19,900 all the way down to where this wicked around 18,100, and you can see that's only about $50 off of our red 50 here. So just by this wick right here coming so close, we could have known that this fib retracement pull was going to be extremely significant. So then we ended up trending sideways for a bit, and finally we came down and our bottom of this move right at that golden zone once again. So by now you know this is the ideal trade to enter, and we're looking for that green line right there. You can see the first spot we resisted when we started rocketing upwards past this previous resistance from about 19,300 all the way up to about 20,800. First major red candle we had right at this green line around 20,800. Finally, we ended up breaking past it. Blue line wasn't too much of a resistance on the way up. We did end up using this candle to come back and test it as support before continuing back upwards really strongly in the next candle, and look where that wicked right to our third target, and actually where price is sitting right around now, around $23,654. Got rejected a few candles later once again, and at this point in time, we're actually just slightly above this, but kind of hovering around it still. Maybe this is going to start pulling back right now, or maybe we'll just keep hovering around this -1, our third target, before we head back upwards towards our fourth and final target of this fib pull, which would end right around here, around $25,960. I'm going to put this as our first potential box for a target we're heading to. Since we know that on the previous fib pull we actually did get to that fourth target, maybe we're going to do the same thing once again. I'll delete this off of my chart just to keep it clean. We have that target box in there. Let's see if we can validate it with anything else. So now that we know we're working off of these 3 significant pivots that we just used our fib retracement pull with, where these 2 were our pivots of the pull, and this is our golden line catch that we had, or even this one over here, we could use either of the 2. Let's pull out a pitchfork and see how that would look. A pitchfork is just going to help us see the market geometry, and if it fits well right now, we can assume that it's going to keep holding the market geometry inside of it until it ends up failing. So all we need to do is click at our low down here, our high up here, and with a pitchfork, we need to actually click in a third spot. I'll use this low in here and see how it looks. I'll hover on this low for a bit, maybe try switching over to this one, see which one I like more, which one fits the price better right now, and I think it's probably this one in here. We can even try playing around with this other pivot in here and see if we can fit the market a little bit better. Remember that the goal of the pitchfork here is to use what we know and try and fit this geometry structure to it to see if it'll continue to use the same geometry over and over. So I've adjusted the pivots of the pitchfork here to use this leftmost pivot in here, the rightmost one in here, which is actually our highest pivot in there, and then this first low that we tested the 618 on right in here. And look how good this pitchfork actually looks for us. We did break below this lower line in here for a bit, however we came back up and used it pretty strong as resistance and support all the way through this entire area for almost an entire week in here, and when we finally broke above it strongly, the first spot we had resistance is on this blue dotted line of our pitchfork. You can see that's our first red candle, and we wicked it a few times. And when we broke through it, we headed back up toward that other blue line where we had strong resistance on the way up there. And when we pulled back, we used this median line of the pitchfork over and over and over again as support, headed back up. Blue dotted line was resistance once again. So I really like the geometry of this pitchfork. I'm going to assume that it'll keep doing what it's doing right now. So maybe we're going to head back down in real time right here to the median line of this pitchfork, which would be about $300 or $400 lower than we are right now. And then we'll start heading back upwards again. So maybe we come to the median in the next few candles here and then head back up either to the dotted line or maybe even to that target that we had drawn before. So the pitchfork is helping us give a little bit of time into when this move might happen, which is projecting around December 22nd if we head straight back up, or maybe we'll reject this blue dotted line a couple more times first, bounce off of it, come back down to the median line over and over, and eventually get up to this target right in here around December 26th. And it just helps us build confluence in this zone if we can get up to here at this point in time. So if the price does follow this yellow arrow, I'd expect a pretty strong sell-off right inside of this box, maybe either back down to this median line, which would be almost $2,000, back to the lower part of this pitchfork, which would be an almost $4,000 move, or maybe we break out of the geometry entirely once we start pulling down. So that's my current prediction of what we're seeing in Bitcoin and the next price target we might actually end up pushing to, which would be around $26,000 or just shy of it. I'm personally looking for other sorts of factors, such as weakness in the market, to actually end up exiting my current position and then buying back at one of these support zones down here. Once we start to come to those, I'll look for a bounce off of them, and if that confirms, then I would re-enter into my position. So some of the other things I'm looking for would include volume, for example. So you can see that if we just look at the peaks of the volume down here, that these volume peaks are actually still increasing. So we have this one in here, this one in here, this one here, here, and then we have this volume peak in here. You can see that the first three volume peaks are pretty similar here, and then we actually start to put in more and more volume as it's peaking. When the trend is weakening, you'll actually see these volume peaks start to decrease. So if the price were to come back down a little bit right now and then head back up, but the volume when we headed back up was less higher than this previous peak, that would show me weakness in the market and would be another signal to start looking for an exit. And lastly, I'll also just start to look for some common candlestick patterns on the daily and 4-hour chart. And if I see an extremely bearish pattern, that would be yet another sign for me to look for an exit and a rebuy later on. So that's my in-depth technical analysis of what I see on Bitcoin right now. I think there's a potential for us to pull back just a little bit to that pitchfork median line that we had, and then start to head back up once again, maybe to that $26,000 range, where that could be the peak of this move before we pull back down, back to retest that $19,700 range, or maybe we even continue upwards from there. However, it's a level that I'll definitely be paying attention to. Now, if you made it this far in the video, that probably means that you're enjoying the content and you'd like to see similar content. If that's the case, do me a huge favor, do yourself a huge favor, click that like button below and hit subscribe for future similar content. All of the content I post is very similar to this technical analysis review, and I think you'll like the other content too. So I hope you learned something from this video, and as always, good luck trading.